There are numerous lasting accomplishments of the civil rights movement that are still in effect today. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended public segregation, but just 3 years later, in 1967, there were still issues involving open housing available for African Americans, and there are still challenges with achieving the goals of the civil rights movement today. My name is Madeline Bress, and I am a 20-year-old white female currently living on the east side of Milwaukee. I grew up in the village of Heartland, which is a suburb that is approximately 30 miles west of Milwaukee. In Heartland, there is a very small percentage of diversity. In 2010, out of about 9,110 people, 95% of the population is white and 0.8% African American. Before this assignment, I had not once heard of the March on Milwaukee Civil Rights History Project, and I think where I come from has a lot to do with that. Living in Milwaukee has introduced me to a lot of history that I was not aware of while living in Heartland. As I began researching the March on Milwaukee, I was astonished by the amount of segregation that occurred 51 years ago right here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, beginning on North 15th Street. Father James E. Grappi, a white Roman Catholic priest, led this march with over 100 members of the Milwaukee Youth Council of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. The March on Milwaukee consisted of thousands of people marching for their right to open housing, and this march took place because in the 1960s, there were not safe or equal housing options for African Americans. There were less housing options available because the number of African Americans residing in Milwaukee were increasing, and there were advancements being made since many of the housing units were old and worn down. The older housing units were also not safe for people to be living in because of them being built with materials that are toxic to humans. African Americans were also not able to expand their neighborhoods because they were turned down when they tried to rent or buy units in other neighborhoods. This march consisted of people creating many signs that stated things such as "We need fair housing," "We demand fair housing now," and "Black Power." Police officers protected those involved in the peaceful march from the thousands of white protesters who did not agree with open housing for African Americans. Eventually, the African Americans stopped marching and began protesting for open housing on the Freedom House property due to violence, harassments, and arrests, but people were still being arrested, so they decided to begin marching again. The priest, along with many others, got arrested for marching for their human rights, but the fight did not end just because they were being arrested and harassed. In this tough time, Dr. Martin Luther King sent them a telegram with encouraging words to help them keep fighting for their rights without violence or destruction. On March 30th, 1968, the Milwaukee youth members of NAACP announced that they were putting a stop to the marches and stated that they were going to continue fighting for their rights in other ways. Shortly after, Martin Luther King was killed on April 4th, 1968, which caused an uproar of violence of the African American communities. A march of 15,000 people was organized on the north side to honor Martin Luther King, and it was the largest march in the history of the city of Milwaukee. On April 11th, 1968, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, which included provisions of open housing. To this day, there is still segregation against African Americans in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. After reading an article published in the Journal Sentinel in 2017, I have found that even after 50 years, there is still segregation happening in the city. Home ownership for African Americans is still below 50%, and Prentice McKinney stated that when African Americans move into white neighborhoods, white people move further away from them. He also stated that Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in the country. In 50 years, there have been many changes from the civil rights movement, but we still have a long way to go in achieving all of these goals across the country.